The night had started innocently enough. The crisp winter air bit at our cheeks as my wife, Vanessa, and I strung up festive lights along the perimeter of our estate. Our neighborhood had always had its quirks, but this year I wanted to make our home stand out. The lights twinkled like a constellation around our property, casting a warm glow over the driveway, where my collection of motorcycles gleamed under the garage lights. 17 Harleys, each one a masterpiece, lined up like soldiers ready for inspection. They were my pride and joy, the fruit of years of hard work and meticulous care. Little did I know that those machines, the symbol of my freedom and defiance, were about to become instruments of our vengeance. I was finishing up the last strand. Along the upper balcony when I heard it, a series of sharp knocks at the front gate. I frowned. It was late, almost 10, and I hadn't expected anyone. "Who could that be at this hour?" I muttered under my breath. Vanessa looked at me, her brow furrowed. She had a sixth sense for trouble, always noticing the subtle tension in the air before I did. I stepped down from the ladder and approached the gate cautiously. 2 men in dark uniforms stood there, badges glinting under the porch light. They looked official enough, but something about their posture seemed off. "Good evening," one of them said, voice clipped. "We're with the HOA Enforcement Division. You're in violation of several neighborhood codes concerning exterior lighting and property displays." Vanessa's eyes widened behind me. "HOA Enforcement Division?" she echoed, incredulous. "I've lived here for 10 years, and I've never heard of anyone being arrested for putting up lights." The man's expression didn't change. "Rules are rules. You're in violation. We'll need to detain anyone resisting compliance." He gestured to the handcuffs on his belt. My stomach sank. Something was wrong. These weren't police officers, but they were dangerous enough to act like it. I stepped in front of Vanessa instinctively. "Listen, she's done nothing illegal. You can't just—" Before I could finish, the second man lunged forward and grabbed Vanessa by the arm. She screamed, the sound echoing through the empty streets. I tried to intervene, but they were faster than expected, handcuffing her wrists tightly behind her back. The metallic click rang like a death knell in my ears. Panic surged through me, but I had to think clearly. Panic would get us both killed. "Step away, sir," the first man warned. "Any interference will be treated as assault." I realized in that moment that these were not legitimate authorities. Real cops wouldn't have acted this way, and HOA enforcers certainly wouldn't be carrying handcuffs and threatening detainment. My heart pounded. Vanessa struggled, trying to free herself, but it was useless. My mind raced, and then anger took over where fear had settled. I had always been a man who valued strategy over brute force, patience over impulse, and now patience was the only weapon that could save Vanessa and teach these impostors a lesson they would never forget. I watched as they forced her into their unmarked black SUV, their faces emotionless behind mirrored sunglasses. The vehicle roared to life and disappeared into the night, leaving only the faint smell of exhaust and the lingering echo of Vanessa's terrified screams. The neighborhood was silent again, but the silence was not comforting. I walked back to the garage, staring at my Harleys lined up like guardians of a fortress I had failed to defend. Each bike represented hours of sweat, late nights and dreams realized on chrome and leather. And now they had witnessed the abduction of the woman I loved. My hands tightened into fists. I would not allow this to go unpunished. I turned on the security monitors, scanning the streets for any trace of the SUV. There was nothing. My mind shifted from searching to planning. Whoever these impostors were, they underestimated me. They had no idea who they were messing with. Over the years, I had learned that fear could be a powerful tool, but revenge was even stronger. And I had every intention of wielding it. I started pulling open toolboxes, my movements methodical despite the rage simmering inside me. Each Harley would play a role in our retribution. They were not just machines. They were extensions of my will, embodiments of the patience, precision, and intensity that I could channel into making these fake officers pay for their arrogance. I traced each bike with my fingers, visualizing the sequence, the meticulous execution of what had to come next. The first step, I realized, was to gather information. I couldn't act blindly. I had to know who these men were, how many of them there were, and what networks they might have access to. But I also knew time was critical. Vanessa's life might depend on my speed and cunning. My phone buzzed. It was a message from a neighbor, casual yet curious. "Did you see those guys? Looked official. Hope everything is okay." I didn't reply. Politeness would get us nowhere. I needed allies, resources, and precision. I pulled up my laptop and started combing through neighborhood HOA records, cross-referencing with local law enforcement listings, searching for anomalies. Patterns began to emerge, inconsistencies that screamed deception. Whoever these imposters were, they had done their homework. But they hadn't accounted for me, and I would exploit that oversight. Hours passed as I worked into the night. I traced phone numbers, scanned vehicle registrations, and began piecing together a profile. The fake officers were not amateurs. They had a plan, a network, and resources. But they underestimated one thing: my resolve. I would not allow Vanessa to be a pawn in their game. Not now, not ever. As dawn approached, I stepped back from the monitors, and the plans sprawled across my desk. The first phase of our counterattack had begun, not with fire or destruction, but with intelligence. Knowledge would be our advantage, and when the moment came, the full force of our wrath would follow. I looked at the Harleys again, polished and gleaming, lined up like soldiers awaiting orders. Each one represented power, control, and inevitability. And soon, they would be the instruments of justice. Vanessa's absence weighed heavily on me, but it was also fuel. Every moment she remained in the hands of those imposters hardened my resolve. I wouldn't just rescue her, I would make sure they would never terrorize another family in our neighborhood again. The fake HOA cops had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated the lengths we were willing to go. And by nightfall, they would learn in the most unforgettable way that crossing us came at a price. The morning sun did nothing to ease the tension that had settled like a weight in my chest. I hadn't slept. There was no room for rest when Vanessa's safety hung in the balance. My mind was a machine of calculation, analyzing every detail from the previous night. The fake officers had been careful, professional even, but they had overlooked one critical factor. They hadn't considered my determination. They didn't know the man they were messing with. I started by tracing the SUV. Security cameras from neighboring houses offered the first clues. Grainy footage showed the vehicle making a series of calculated turns, avoiding main streets, disappearing into a maze of suburban roads. I froze each frame, analyzing the vehicle, the angles, even the reflections on nearby windows, to identify possible license plate fragments. It was painstaking work, but every bit of information mattered. I also began reaching out to contacts from my past, people who owed me favors, people who knew the hidden networks of our city. Vanessa's abduction wasn't just a crime. It was an insult, a challenge that demanded response. Within an hour, I had a small team of trusted allies ready to assist. Tech specialists, former security personnel, and even one old friend who had connections in private investigation. We coordinated through encrypted channels, sharing details, compiling dossiers on potential suspects. Each lead was a thread, and I was determined to weave them into a net tight enough to catch anyone who had dared lay a hand on my wife. I also began preparing the Harleys. Each bike had been maintained to perfection, a reflection of my obsession with precision. But tonight, they wouldn't just be for display or leisurely rides, they would be part of the plan. I inspected each engine, each brake, every fuel line, imagining scenarios where they could be deployed with surgical accuracy. This wasn't mindless destruction. It was controlled, calculated retribution. Every bike would play a role, each move choreographed to maximize impact and minimize collateral damage. Meanwhile, Vanessa remained in the hands of those imposters, and I couldn't let myself dwell on that thought for too long. Panic would cloud my judgment, and we didn't have that luxury. Instead, I projected her location mentally, mapping out potential hideouts, abandoned warehouses, and private lots that could serve as temporary holding areas. My knowledge of the city's underbelly became a weapon. I knew where they could hide, and I knew how to reach them without being detected. By late afternoon, the investigation yielded results. One of the phone numbers used to coordinate the abduction traced back to a private security company with a murky reputation. Further digging revealed connections to several neighborhood HOA officials who had a history of overstepping their authority. It was enough to confirm what I had suspected all along. These weren't legitimate enforcers. They were opportunists, exploiting the veneer of authority to intimidate and control. And now they had crossed the wrong line. I gathered my team in the garage, the Harleys looming around us like silent sentinels. "Here's the situation," I said, my voice calm but edged with intensity. "They took Vanessa. They're using fear as their weapon. But fear is temporary. What lasts is consequence. We're going to find them, and we're going to make sure they regret every decision that led them to this moment." Plans were drawn, contingencies prepared, and roles assigned. Each team member had a specific task. Some would monitor communications, others would track the SUV's movements, and a small strike team would be ready for extraction. But central to all of this was timing. We couldn't act prematurely. Vanessa's safety came first, and every move had to be deliberate. As night fell, the streets transformed. Shadows stretched long across the pavement, and the faint glow of streetlights created pockets of darkness, perfect for covert observation. I mounted my first Harley, the leather hugging me like armor, the engine purring with restrained power. Riding through the quiet streets, I felt a sense of focus unlike anything I had experienced before. Each turn of the throttle was precise, each movement intentional. I was no longer just a man. I was a force of purpose. We split into units, the city grid forming our tactical map. The SUV was spotted near an industrial district, an area filled with abandoned warehouses and empty lots. I signaled my team through encrypted comms, coordinating positions and establishing perimeters. The fake officers were professionals, but they lacked imagination. They had prepared for authority. They hadn't prepared for someone who could anticipate every move, someone willing to fight fire with fire. Hours of surveillance passed. Every moment brought new information. Routes they favored, guards they posted, even patterns of communication that revealed shifts in their attention. I catalogued it all meticulously. By midnight, I had everything I needed. The extraction plan was set, precise to the last detail. But before any action could be taken, I had to ensure they wouldn't anticipate us. Misdirection became our ally. While my team prepared the extraction, I began a series of diversions. Calls, fake sightings, and electronic footprints designed to confuse and scatter them. The goal wasn't to harm. It was to create an environment where control shifted entirely to us. Meanwhile, I thought about Vanessa. Even as I orchestrated strategy and diversion, her presence was a constant in my mind. I imagined her strength, her resilience, and the anger she would feel when she knew what we had planned. That anger would fuel her survival instinct, making the extraction smoother. The stakes were higher than anything I had faced before, but I embraced the challenge. Fear had no place here. Only resolve mattered. Then came the breakthrough. One of the diversions triggered a reaction. Through a combination of surveillance and electronic tracking, we pinpointed the SUV to a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Minimal security, only 2 guards and no obvious exits. An ideal location for us to move in without alerting them prematurely. I felt a surge of adrenaline. Vanessa was close, and the culmination of hours of meticulous planning was about to be tested in reality. I returned to the garage, my mind already moving to the next phase. The Harleys would be central, not as weapons of destruction yet, but as tools to control the environment. Noise, presence, intimidation, they were silent partners in what would come next. Each bike had a specific role, blocking exits, creating diversions, and ensuring that our adversaries had no room to maneuver. Everything was synchronized, everything accounted for. By 2 in the morning, the team was in position. Radios whispered in low tones, cameras fed live images to my screen, and the Harleys were lined up, engines idling with barely restrained power. The air was thick with anticipation. Every second counted, and I felt the weight of responsibility, knowing that one mistake could cost Vanessa dearly. And then, with a final review of the surveillance feed, I made the decision. The fake HOA cops had underestimated us from the beginning. They had taken Vanessa thinking fear would silence us. They had made the fatal error of thinking they could control people who refused to be intimidated. Tonight, they would learn that control was an illusion and consequences were inevitable. The warehouse loomed in the darkness, a jagged silhouette against the faint glow of distant city lights. It was the kind of place where secrets festered, abandoned yet alive with shadows. The SUV sat parked just inside the fenced perimeter, its tinted windows reflecting the dim light, hiding the horror within. Vanessa. My wife. My focus narrowed until nothing else existed but her safety and the reckoning that awaited those who dared touch her. I signaled to my team through the comms, each voice calm and precise. Positions locked. Extraction in T-5. The tension was palpable. My pulse raced not with fear but with anticipation. Every detail we had observed over the past 24 hours converged on this moment. Years of strategy, patience, and preparation had led us here, and the Harleys, each engine a restrained beast, waited like coiled springs, ready to assert control over the scene. I moved first, slipping through the shadows along the perimeter fence, my eyes scanning for surveillance cameras, tripwires, or any unexpected obstacles. 2 guards patrolled near the entrance, unaware of the silent figures observing them from the darkness. With careful timing, I dispatched the first silently, a swift strike to the back of the neck that left him unconscious, but unharmed. The second guard never saw me coming, tripping over a piece of debris as I pressed him to the ground. Within seconds, both were secured, blindfolded and restrained. Inside the warehouse, the SUV's doors were locked, Vanessa trapped within. I crouched behind a stack of crates, analyzing the interior through the tinted windows. She was there, her hands cuffed, eyes wide but fierce. A wave of relief washed over me, but I swallowed it immediately. There was no time for sentiment. Every second counted. I activated the next phase. Outside, the Harleys roared to life, engines screaming in synchronized intensity, the sound reverberating through the empty streets. The noise was deafening, an assault on anyone expecting silence. From inside the warehouse, I could see the impostors flinch. They had not anticipated this level of force, this display of presence. It was psychological warfare, controlled chaos meant to disorient and intimidate before we made our move. One of my team members, Mark, signaled from a side entrance. "Doors clear. Extraction route ready." I nodded subtly. Using the distraction of the roaring Harleys, I approached the SUV, tools in hand to override the locks. Vanessa watched me with recognition, hope flickering in her eyes. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, voice tight but steady. "I knew you wouldn't let them." I cut her off with a shake of my head, a silent command to stay calm. Words were unnecessary. She trusted me, and that trust was everything. With a few swift maneuvers, the locks clicked open, and I yanked the door. Vanessa slipped out, but the danger was far from over. The impostors had regrouped inside the warehouse, realizing the extraction had begun. Their shouts echoed, a chaotic mix of threats and disbelief. The real test began now. My team surged forward, moving with precision, herding the impostors toward a predetermined path where the Harleys could control movement. Engines screamed, lights flashed, and the empty warehouse became a theater of orchestrated power. Every sound, every vibration, every movement was designed to intimidate, to break the enemy's composure. Vanessa stayed close, guided by my hand and the rhythm of our plan. My mind raced with contingencies. If one thing went wrong, if a single guard regained control, the extraction could fail. But our preparation paid off. Every movement, every distraction had been anticipated. The impostors stumbled, caught off guard by the combination of human precision and mechanical dominance. Finally, we reached the exit. The night air hit us sharp and freeing. Vanessa breathed deeply, relief flooding her features as she took in the open sky. But there was no time to linger. I positioned the Harleys strategically, engines humming with potential violence, ready to block any pursuit. The impostors were trapped in a cage of their own making, surrounded by overwhelming force. One of them, the leader, attempted to rush toward us, a futile act of desperation. I stepped forward, voice cold and commanding. "You made a mistake. You underestimated what happens when people fight back." He froze, realizing that every route of escape had been accounted for. The Harleys were not just tools. They were symbols of our preparedness, our control, and our resolve. Vanessa stood beside me now, her presence steadying me, her fear replaced by determination. Together, we watched as the impostors realized their defeat. Their attempts to intimidate had been turned against them. The warehouse, once a symbol of their power, was now a stage for their humiliation and reckoning. With the extraction complete, I knew the next phase had to begin. The Harleys were not merely displays of power, they were instruments of the lesson that needed to be delivered. These impostors had crossed a line. They had dared to touch what was ours, to threaten the safety of someone we loved, and in that violation, they had sealed their fate. I rode the lead Harley, Vanessa holding on to me, feeling the raw energy of the machine beneath us. The city street stretched ahead, dark and empty, a canvas for the retribution that would soon unfold. My team followed, each bike a silent declaration of inevitability. The impostors were behind us, trapped and disoriented, and there was no mercy left to give. By the time we returned to the neighborhood, the plan for the next stage was clear. It would be decisive, undeniable, and unforgettable. Every action taken, every movement executed, would teach a lesson that could never be ignored. The Harleys would play their role in full force, not as instruments of mindless anger, but as extensions of strategy, precision, and consequence. Vanessa, now safe but still processing the terror of the night, looked at me and whispered, "What happens now?" I smiled, a grim yet confident curve of the lips. "Now we make sure no one ever dares do this again." Her eyes widened slightly, the anticipation mirrored in my own. The true reckoning was about to begin. The night was far from over, and the shadows of vengeance stretched long over our neighborhood. The night air was thick with anticipation as we returned to our estate, the adrenaline from the extraction still coursing through our veins. Vanessa clung to me as we entered the garage, the Harleys lined up like a regiment ready for battle. My mind was already several steps ahead, plotting the next phase. The fake HOA cops had humiliated us, abducted Vanessa, and threatened our peace. Now it was time to show them the full measure of consequences. This wasn't about rage, it was about precision, strategy, and making an unforgettable statement. I gathered the team, laying out the plan with meticulous detail. "Tonight we take control completely," I said, voice steady but edged with intensity. "The impostors believed they could intimidate us. They were wrong. Each Harley here represents power, control, and inevitability. We'll use them to target what they value: control, reputation, and anything that makes them feel untouchable. The goal isn't chaos, it's justice, visible and undeniable." Vanessa, still shaken but resolute, nodded. "Let's make sure they never think they can touch anyone like that again." Her eyes blazed with determination. I felt a surge of pride and reassurance. Together, we were unstoppable. We divided into units. Each Harley would serve a purpose, some to block access points, others to create diversions, and a few strategically placed to inflict irreversible consequences on the impostors' assets. I had spent hours studying their patterns, their habits, even the locations where they stored vehicles, equipment, and anything they relied on to maintain their facade of authority. Everything was mapped, timed, and choreographed. The first target was their fleet of vehicles, the tools that lent them an air of legitimacy. A small convoy of black SUVs, sedans, and trucks had been identified in a secure lot near the industrial district. I led the strike team, riding my lead Harley, the engine roaring like a war cry. Vanessa followed, adrenaline sharpening her focus. As we approached the lot through back roads and alleyways, avoiding main streets to maintain the element of surprise. As we arrived, the impostors were caught completely off guard. The sudden appearance of roaring Harleys in formation, engines screaming, lights flashing, was enough to throw them into disarray. Shouts erupted as they tried to react, but our preparation was flawless. We had blocked all exits with strategically placed bikes, forcing them to confront the reality that control had shifted completely. The vehicles were vulnerable, and the decision was made. Fuel lines were severed, ignition systems disabled, rendering each SUV and sedan completely inoperable. Sparks flew as engines were disabled, and smoke began to curl from the compromised electronics. The impostors realized too late that their symbols of power were gone, stripped from them with ruthless precision. Their screams of frustration echoed through the lot, but the team stayed calm, executing every maneuver with clinical efficiency. Next, we moved to the neighborhood streets, where they had staked out positions and used intimidation tactics. The Harleys became extensions of our will, engines roaring in patterns designed to dominate sound and space. Tires spun, leaving marks on asphalt as we created controlled chaos, disrupting their lines of sight and communication. They tried to organize, but every move was anticipated, every retreat blocked. The night belonged to us. Then came the centerpiece of our retribution, their prized possessions. In the industrial district, a warehouse stored their equipment, gadgets, and tools used to maintain the illusion of authority. We had studied the layout, noting weak points and potential hazards. Using the Harleys as both distraction and force, we breached the perimeter, engines and lights creating confusion and fear. Smoke, noise, and sudden movement overwhelmed their senses. They could not coordinate, could not escape. Their confidence crumbled as they watched their carefully curated tools of control being destroyed with relentless efficiency. Vanessa watched from my side, a mix of horror and empowerment in her expression. "They never thought anyone would fight back like this," she said. I nodded, acknowledging her insight. "They also never thought the people they targeted would be precise, calculated, and unstoppable." Her resolve hardened, and I knew she would never let fear rule her again. By the time the final warehouse doors were breached, the impostors were cornered, trapped by the roaring Harleys and the unstoppable force of our plan. Every exit blocked, every line of communication disrupted. They had no choice but to face the consequences of their arrogance. I could see the panic in their eyes, the recognition that they had underestimated the wrong people, that their actions had sparked a storm they could not contain. Then the final act began. The Harley's engines, screaming, were used to ignite controlled charges that destroyed vehicles and equipment in a calculated manner. Flames roared, metal twisted, and smoke billowed into the night sky. The destruction was total, precise, and unavoidable. Every piece of their so-called power was reduced to ash and ruin, leaving the impostors staring at the consequences of their hubris. Through it all, Vanessa remained steady, her presence a constant reminder of what we were fighting for. She understood that this was more than revenge. It was a statement, a lesson that those who wield power without accountability would face consequences that could not be ignored. The night air was thick with smoke, but it carried a sense of justice, of balance restored. When the chaos finally subsided, the impostors were left humiliated, defeated, and powerless. Their vehicles gone, their equipment destroyed, and their reputation shattered. They had no recourse, no allies, and no leverage. They had been confronted with the full weight of what happens when ordinary people refuse to be intimidated. Vanessa turned to me, her eyes shining with a mix of awe and satisfaction. "They'll never forget this night," she said. I nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. This was more than revenge. It was closure, empowerment, and a declaration that fear would no longer dictate our lives. We mounted the Harleys one final time, engines low and throaty, riding back through the streets we had reclaimed. The neighborhood lay quiet, the echoes of destruction and power fading into the night. We had made our statement, and the consequences would ripple far beyond this night. Anyone who dared cross us in the future would understand the cost of arrogance, deceit, and intimidation. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting pale gold across streets still scarred by the chaos of the night. The smell of smoke lingered, a reminder of the Harley's controlled wrath and the precision with which we had dismantled the impostor's world. Vanessa and I stood side by side, surveying the aftermath. Her hands rested lightly on my arm, her breathing steady. But I could see the storm that had passed within her: fear, fury, and finally relief. The impostors had been left broken, humiliated, and powerless. Their fleet of vehicles was gone, their equipment reduced to ash, and their illusions of authority completely shattered. The neighborhood itself seemed to breathe again, the oppressive tension that had gripped it dissipating with the destruction of those who had sought to control through fear. But I knew the night was not over. There were still consequences to manage, loose threads to tie, and a final reckoning to ensure that no one would ever challenge us again. We returned to the estate, moving with quiet precision. Vanessa followed me into the garage, her eyes scanning the Harleys lined up like sentinels. Each bike bore the mark of last night's operations, yet none had been damaged beyond repair. They had performed their roles flawlessly, extensions of our will, instruments of calculated justice. I ran my hand along the leather of the lead Harley, feeling the power that had been unleashed. "They'll think twice before ever crossing anyone again," I murmured. Vanessa nodded, her jaw set. "And if they do?" she asked. a flicker of the same determination that had carried us through the night now burning in her eyes. Then they'll face the same consequences. I allowed a small smile. She had changed. The terror she had felt, the helplessness, had transformed into strength and resolve. She was no longer a passive participant in the world. She was an equal partner in its reclamation. Our attention shifted to the final phase, ensuring that the impostors could not rebuild or retaliate. Through the investigation and surveillance conducted the night before, we had identified their homes, hidden caches, and even personal assets used to maintain their network of intimidation. Each location was approached with meticulous planning, Harleys and team members positioned to maximize efficiency and control while minimizing risk to the surrounding neighborhood. The first house was a quiet suburban home, nondescript and seemingly ordinary. But inside, the impostors had kept records, communication devices, and proof of their manipulations. We moved swiftly, disabling alarm systems, securing doors, and taking inventory of the materials. Everything that could be used to perpetuate their schemes was confiscated or destroyed. Sparks flew as electronics were dismantled, documents shredded, and any trace of their previous control systematically erased. At each location, the impostors were nowhere to be found, their arrogance having convinced them that fleeing would be safer than standing and facing the consequences of their actions. But the trail of destruction and authority we left was unmistakable. Word would spread quickly among those who had been watching, a lesson in inevitability and the cost of underestimating people determined to reclaim what was theirs. By mid-morning, the neighborhood was quiet again. Windows opened, neighbors emerged cautiously, and the first murmurs of speculation rippled through the streets. But there was no fear now, only awe and the quiet satisfaction of having witnessed the dismantling of a corrupt authority that had operated unchecked for far too long. Vanessa and I stood in the driveway, surveying the streets we had reclaimed. The Harleys idled, silent now, their work done. I turned to Vanessa. "It's over," I said softly, though the word felt heavier than it should. It was not just the end of the night's chaos. It was the end of the era those impostors had created. She smiled, a mixture of relief and triumph, her hand finding mine. "For now," she replied, eyes glinting with the knowledge that vigilance would always be necessary. But for the first time in a long while, we had the upper hand. The impostors' phones began to ring in the background, alerts, calls, messages from allies who had no answers, no solutions, and no leverage. Their network crumbled, their reputation irreparably damaged. Word of the Harleys, the destruction, and the precise retribution spread quickly, reaching ears that had once feared their intimidation. Now those same ears listened with caution, a reminder that actions had consequences, and that the wronged could become unstoppable. In the quiet moments that followed, Vanessa and I reflected on the night. The fear, the chaos, and the anger had been intense, but so had the resolve and coordination that had carried us through. We had taken control, not recklessly, but deliberately, with strategy, precision, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The impostors had learned the hard way that intimidation and arrogance could not stand against preparation, intelligence, and the strength of those they sought to harm. And yet, even as the adrenaline faded, a sense of solemnity remained. Revenge had been necessary, but it was also a reminder of the vulnerability that had been exploited. We had been forced into a position no one should endure, and though we had triumphed, the memory of Vanessa's fear lingered. It was a lesson. Vigilance, preparedness, and trust in one another were the true keys to survival and empowerment. By late morning, the neighborhood returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after such a night. People went about their routines, but there was a new respect, an unspoken acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted. Vanessa and I moved through the streets quietly, not seeking recognition, but ensuring that everything that needed attention had been addressed. The Harleys remained as guardians, symbols of what had transpired, and reminders that boundaries had been drawn and enforced. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the streets, I felt a sense of closure settling over me. Vanessa was safe. The impostors had been confronted and neutralized, and the neighborhood had been reclaimed. But more importantly, we had proven something essential. Fear could be confronted. Power could be challenged, and those who dared to cross us would face consequences that could not be ignored. Vanessa turned to me, her expression resolute. "We did it," she said, though there was more in her tone than mere accomplishment. There was growth, empowerment, and the knowledge that together we were capable of overcoming threats that once seemed insurmountable. I squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of what we had accomplished. "Yes," I replied, "and anyone who ever doubts us again will learn the same lesson." The evening air was calm, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night that had changed everything. The streets of the neighborhood were quiet, the faint glow of the setting sun reflecting off the asphalt. As the lingering scent of smoke from the destruction of the impostors' vehicles and equipment still hung faintly in the air. Vanessa and I stood at the edge of our driveway. The Harleys lined up behind us like silent sentinels. They had served their purpose and now waited, engines silent, a testament to precision and power that had been wielded with intent, rather than recklessness. I watched Vanessa as she surveyed the neighborhood, her eyes alert but calm. The fear that had once clouded her expression was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. She had endured abduction, terror, and the violation of our home, yet she stood here unbroken. It was a reminder that strength often emerges from the moments when we feel weakest, that resilience can be forged in fire and adversity. I reflected on the events of the past 24 hours. Every detail, every movement, every calculated decision had been critical. From the initial abduction to the extraction, from the destruction of their vehicles and equipment to the final cleanup of their assets, nothing had been left to chance. The impostors had underestimated us, and in doing so they had sealed their fate. Their arrogance had been their undoing, and our methodical, measured response had ensured that they could never recover. Vanessa turned to me, her hand brushing mine, a gesture of reassurance and solidarity. "Do you think they'll ever try to come back?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with lingering concern. I shook my head. "Not a chance. They know now that crossing us comes with consequences they cannot escape. Word will spread, and anyone who thinks of challenging us again will think twice." She nodded, absorbing the gravity of what had occurred, yet also feeling the empowerment that came with knowing we had reclaimed control. The Harleys, now silent, seemed to carry a weight of their own. Each bike had been part of the plan, not as a symbol of aggression, but as a tool of strategy, intimidation, and precision. They had allowed us to dominate the environment, control the situation, and deliver justice in a way that was both undeniable and unforgettable. I ran my hand along the leather of the lead Harley, feeling the hum of energy that lingered even in stillness. These machines had been our instruments of balance, restoring order where chaos had been imposed. As night fell completely, we decided to take a ride. Not for revenge, not for intimidation, but for catharsis. The streets were empty, the city quiet, and the hum of the engines beneath us became a rhythm of reflection and release. Vanessa clung to me, the cool night air brushing past, her presence grounding me after the intensity of the day. For the first time since the abduction, I allowed myself to feel a sense of relief, knowing that she was safe and that our message had been delivered. We rode slowly through the neighborhood, observing the subtle ways the residents had begun to reclaim their own sense of peace. Cars pulled into driveways, lights flicked on. Children's laughter could be faintly heard in the distance. The fear that had once permeated these streets was lifting, replaced by a cautious optimism. It was a reminder that the actions we took had consequences far beyond our immediate circle, rippling through the community and restoring a sense of justice that had been absent. Returning home, Vanessa and I parked the Harleys in the garage, their engines quiet, yet still alive with potential. We entered the house, the familiar surroundings now imbued with a renewed sense of security. I glanced at Vanessa, noting the mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction on her face. "We did what we had to do," I said quietly, almost as if speaking to myself. "And no one will ever forget it." She smiled faintly, the shadows of the night still lingering in her expression, but softened by relief. The evening passed in reflection. We reviewed every step, every detail, ensuring that nothing had been overlooked. Communication lines had been severed, assets destroyed, and the impostors left powerless. We documented evidence of their activities just in case, but the necessity of further action had diminished. They had been confronted, humbled, and taught lessons that would echo far beyond this night. As we settled into the calm of the night, Vanessa finally spoke, her voice carrying both gratitude and resolve. "I was terrified, but I knew you wouldn't let them take me. So I knew you'd fight for us." Her words, simple yet profound, resonated deeply. In that moment, the gravity of the night's events crystallized. We had not only reclaimed what was ours, but we had also demonstrated the power of resilience, planning, and unwavering determination. Fear had been confronted, intimidation neutralized, and justice delivered in a way that was permanent and undeniable. The Harleys remained in the garage, a reminder that while the immediate danger had passed, vigilance would always be necessary. They were symbols of strength and preparedness, tools that had allowed us to navigate chaos with precision, yet they were also reminders that power, when wielded responsibly and strategically, could restore balance, protect what mattered most, and deliver consequences to those who had overstepped their bounds. As dawn approached once again, the neighborhood lay quiet, the echoes of the night's events fading into memory, but the lessons endured. Vanessa and I had faced fear, confrontation, and adversity, emerging stronger, more connected, and fully aware of our ability to protect and defend what was ours. The impostors had been dismantled, their control obliterated, and our message had been made unmistakably clear. Those who threaten others will face consequences that cannot be ignored. Finally, we stood together on the balcony, watching the sunrise. The neighborhood stretched out before us, peaceful yet marked by the invisible lines of last night's justice. Vanessa leaned against me, her presence a grounding force, and I felt a profound sense of closure. The night had been long, the challenges immense, but together we had prevailed. Fear had been transformed into strength, intimidation into empowerment, and chaos into deliberate order. The story of that night would not be forgotten, not by us, not by the impostors, and not by anyone who might have considered taking advantage of others in the neighborhood. It was a night of reckoning, a lesson in precision, and a demonstration of the power of courage, preparation, and unwavering determination. Vanessa and I had reclaimed our lives, restored balance, and ensured that justice was both seen and felt. As we turned to head inside, the Harleys resting silently in the garage, I knew one thing for certain: no one would ever again doubt our resolve. And as long as we stood together, prepared and vigilant, there would be no fear that could touch us, no impostor that could threaten our home, and no force that could undermine the bond we had strengthened through fire, strategy, and the unrelenting pursuit of justice.